Good afternoon, and we've now reached the final session of the Future of Pharmaceutical Analysis 2026. And this one is a little bit different, and I think actually incredibly valuable to all of us as scientists, process engineers, quality control testers, and so on, because it's all about making the financial pitch for continuous manufacturing and how you need to think a little bit about a little bit like a CEO to make it happen. We all know the scientific case, we all know the efficiencies it can get, but how do you actually translate that into something that the C-suite can understand? Joining me for this is Professor Cliff Rossi, who is Professor of the Practice, Executive in Residence, SERC Director, and probably about 15 other roles at the University of Maryland. Cliff has spent his career looking at how we can communicate these kind of things differently, how we can appeal to CEOs, and how we can win over the C-suite. So I'm going to let him start. Over to you, Cliff.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, to your point, I am a very different presenter today than who else you have had so far in this session. And by way of kind of furthering, kind of giving you context for where I'm going to go with this, I spent the better part of about 25 years managing risk at large banking institutions here in the United States, such as Citigroup, for example. And what I found over this time is I've kind of like now migrated a lot of my work into other sectors, including pharmaceutical, is in the case of investing into new technologies, new areas that companies can leverage, sometimes that presents a lot of uncertainty for those decision makers to have to decide where am I going to allocate my capital for whichever project we're thinking of. So let me share my screen. And again, the title of this presentation is Making the Financial Pitch for Continuous Manufacturing, Thinking Like a CFO. And what I want to do is in the next hour here, kind of walk through these topics. First of all, kind of again, just highlighting, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think most of you sort of already know this, that is making the actual technical and engineering case for pharmaceutical continuous manufacturing, or PCM, and the business opportunities for that. I'm going to highlight that a little bit, just to kind of refresh everybody, talk a little bit about the current implementation challenges that we see around PCM, and then I'm going to dive into more directly the financial risk considerations, how to pitch PCM to a financial audience. And it is a different group, a different mindset when you're going in front of your controller or your CFO or the finance department, whoever it is, you have to make that translation too, and then talk a little bit about the takeaways and how you can kind of leverage what we're talking about in this presentation today for your work. One thing before we start, I also want to say that a lot of the work that you see here has been done jointly with a great colleague of mine in Pharmatech Associates, which is a USP company, Richard Steiner. He and I have been kind of joined at the hip for the last year or more on trying to find ways to promote building better business cases for continuous manufacturing across the product spectrum, including biologics. So kudos to him, and thank him for all his support for what we're doing. First of all, making the case for PCM. I think it goes without question. If I kind of compare batch processing, which has been around for probably 100 years or so in the pharma sector and other sectors as well, petrochemicals, for example, et cetera, that we see greater efficiency with advanced technologies like continuous. We see smaller physical footprints, lower scrap to defect rates, improved quality and process controls, just-in-time inventory management, and sustainability cost savings as well. You can kind of read the tail of the tape, if you will, by looking at those comparisons in the table below. And I'm presuming Ian will probably make these slides available if anybody's interested in them after this session. But so the case is there, and there's enough that's been written and researched for the last several years anyway. All the pilots that have been done at the FDA with companies on PCM, and it's clear that there's value in doing it. When you start to dissect that a little bit further into what kind of business needs and what kind of business cases are there, you have to kind of segment the pharma industry into various pieces, right? So you've got what I'll call innovators, both large cap and small cap institutions, that is the large players, the small players, the CRDMOs, over the counter types of producers, and then the generic producers. And that's all wrapped up sometimes together in different relationships. But the idea from this slide is to say that fast movers in the area of adoption of continuous manufacturing are going to take advantage and gain market share coming down the road from PCM, simply because there, as we see in that prior slide, there's a lot of advantages. The problem with that, right, whether you are a so-called innovator or an OTC manufacturer of a product or a generic product manufacturer or even a CRDMO, is that there are uncertainties that come about from leveraging these new technologies that create some level of holdback to moving forward with them from an investment standpoint, because they all have potentially large capital investments and then ongoing operating expenses associated with them. So you have to distill that down into a way that financial managers can meaningfully understand and get a handle on their level of confidence about making a very costly investment decision. And that's really what we're going to talk about a little bit more. But talking about these business needs and these business cases, if we look at this from the standpoint of large cap innovators, for example, from a time to market standpoint, there's all sorts of things that continuous manufacturing brings to the table, if you will. Flexibility, around your pipelines, reduced technology transfers, your ability to scale your business out even further, quality by design and enhanced quality profile of what you're actually producing using or leveraging continuous manufacturing processes versus the tried and true batch processes. There's also benefits on the supply chain side too. So where we might be able to kind of reduce some of the unpredictabilities around demand. Certainly we saw some of that during the pandemic and elsewhere in certain product types. There's also a certain reputation risk that you can reduce by being able to have a lower defect rate, lower issues associated with your supply chains by leveraging continuous manufacturing. The costs associated with bad quality that we've heard of before, your ability to even deal with sustainability goals and objectives can be benefited from continuous manufacturing. For the small cap innovators, right, they have concerns around financial risk, and we're going to, and that's not just specific to small cap innovators; it's there everywhere. But certainly with small cap innovators, with the limitations on finances that they have, that's a big one. They have small product portfolios. They have limited resources. There's regulatory risk that because of their size makes it maybe a bigger hurdle or challenge for them to actually have to deal with. But one of the ways they can kind of mitigate some of those risks is to collaborate more with vendors for initial trials and process development. Start small, right? Learn to walk before you run, so to speak, and maybe even partner with CDMOs to lower that financial risk. Kind of partner from that standpoint. Same thing on the generic side. There's all sorts of challenges and risks, and there's also opportunities. And I'm just kind of breezing through some of these because I think it's important to understand that each of these different players in pharmaceutical manufacturing have come at this from a different lens, if you will. The challenges and the risks. In the case of generic producers, their pressure on good manufacturing processes, what their product portfolios will allow them to produce. But the opportunities are clearly there. The operating expense savings through process improvement by way of the use of continuous manufacturing processes, quality improvements, higher sales through more competitiveness because you can kind of have greater throughput across multiple lines using continuous. And then and there's a competitive advantage too over time by making astute kind of timed investments in CM that make it give you a leg up on the competition, so to speak. For CDMOs, I think what we're going to see is that the need for CDMO PCM capacity is going to grow very fast. And so from that standpoint, uh, being able to identify where those opportunities are, come up with flexible solutions to serve a broad customer base that CDMOs have. And again, starting to learn early about the benefits of PCM will be to their advantage. Okay. Lastly, here for OTC and nutraceuticals, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of variability, if you will, in production. And yet, again, on the opportunity side, there's the flexibility, there's the ability to deal with the quality issues, replacement of obsolete equipment, site consolidation, benefiting from the smaller footprint that CM actually produces. So the bottom line, and looking at these cases, and what I want to talk about the rest of our time here, is less about the business case and some of those risks and challenges, but how do you make the case that PCM will actually win the day for your company versus where you've been in the past with batch pharmaceutical manufacturing. And so back several years ago, the work, you might ask yourself, how does an ex-banking guy get into the pharma continuous manufacturing financial risk business? And it started with the FDA's Office of Pharmaceutical Quality reaching out to me to bring a fresh pair of eyes to understanding the risks and economics associated with advanced technologies like CM. So I did a study for them under a research grant that they provided, and it was leveraging techniques that we use in financial services and have used for quite some time, because we face similar issues where, in the case of pharmaceutical manufacturing, it is a physical manufacturing process. For us on the financial services side, we have what we call virtual loan manufacturing processes, but we produce, our goods, our loans, if you will, and we have a whole pipeline and production factory, if you will, assembly line that are built on a set of, if you will, very much like batch processes that go through a lot of high level of manual touch activities. Well, the way we get comfortable with bringing in, let's say, a new product or a new process that we have is by trying to leverage technology, analytics, that is, that will allow us to look through a range of outcomes, a range of different outcomes for us to get our finance folks comfortable with the fact that there isn't just one path or one outcome that a bank or a financial institution will observe over, let's say, the next 30 years of using this process, but there could be hundreds, thousands, an infinite number that create a whole distribution of outcomes. And that's really where we can now start to have a conversation and get our financial folks, our CFOs, comfortable, to give them a level of confidence that if we invest in this technology, we have a 95% confidence level of it being profitable. That's effectively core to being able to kind of sell, if you will, this type of application or this type of technology to your financial professionals. So some of the adoption barriers in biologics or biopharma, right? It's all about things like the substantial upfront capital required for equipment and the facility build out. That is a hurdle, because it's very easy for an investment decision maker to say, why would we swap out a batch process that's already, to my second point here, been fully depreciated, and all we have to do is cover our operating and maintenance costs on an annual basis? Why would I invest millions of dollars into this new facility when I could just keep going with what I know is going to work? We're going to come to some of the messaging around that in a second. In addition to the depreciation, or what we call the sunk capital trap, that is that batch processing facilities, once they're depreciated, I mean, you've written them off. I mean, they're still operating. It creates much wider margins than if you're kind of bringing a new facility, a new continuous manufacturing facility online. Prolonged negative cash flows until the first product approvals, which is kind of in that 3 to 5 year range, happen, meaning that for the first 3 to 5 years, NPV, what we call net present value, which is a yardstick that all financial decision makers are using to say yes or no to projects of this type. If you're getting, negative cash flows for the first 3 to 5 years, that creates a financial drag for the company. And so you're going to have to be able to show that over the long haul, right? It's not just a short-term investment mentality, but over the longer period that this shifts and that CM pays big dividends from a financial standpoint down the road. There's also the high initial human resource cost to recruit and retain specialized expertise required for CM versus your batch processing today. That's kind of a separate issue. I'll put that over on the side. Elevated risk to high biologic attrition rates in clinical trials and uncertainties in regulatory pathways. That's there even, if we talk about the non-biologic side, right? Standard type of drugs, if you will. But nonetheless, it's an issue. And we're going to talk a little bit about regulatory uncertainty and some of the things that have come a long way since that time, including, as I say here, the support that the FDA has of companies to adopt PCM. It varies in other countries, but there have been a lot of movement and interest in moving toward harmonization of standards, global standardization, that is, of how PCM can be adopted on a global scale through changes and enhancements to ICH Q13, which is guidance on continuous manufacturing. So we're really starting to see some of the regulatory uncertainties melt away a little bit. I think there's always in the back of folks' minds the fact that anytime they have to go and gain regulatory approval for a drug using a new process, even though they're using batch today, there are timelines to that, right? Time to market issues potentially, and that creates this regulatory uncertainty. That said, I believe the FDA has approved 17 drugs to be utilized with continuous manufacturing processes. So we're moving down the road, maybe not as fast as many people would like to see, but from a regulatory standpoint, things are certainly starting to move in a favorable way for adoption of CM. This next one, the second to last one, cost uncertainties. This really speaks to where financial managers struggle with trying to understand, why would I invest in a process where there's a lot of cost uncertainty, both on the upfront capital costs as well as on the ongoing operating expenses, and even maybe below the surface aspects of what drives each of those that we still don't quite have a great handle on. Help me understand, how do I get my arms around that in a way that, again, gives me a level of confidence to say, yes, it's clear to me that I can be 95, I can be 99% confident that when I make this investment, that I'm going to wind up being, find that this is profitable in the long term. And then also existing technology bias and speed to market. This is just the inherent, we've been using batch for a long time. It's met our needs. It is relatively low cost, and we understand it. And we're just going to continue to apply it. It's that sort of technology bias that I'm speaking to on one of the barriers that we see here. Okay, so with all of that, with all of the benefits from PCM, the business case, the use cases that is associated with it, what I keep hearing from the scientific community, the engineers, et cetera, that are actually scratching their head when they tell me they're running up against the brick wall at times, speaking with their finance teams that are saying, we just think we're going to stick with batch, and maybe at some point in the future we might think about testing it. There are other companies that are, as I said earlier, they're innovators. They're first movers on these things that have been at the forefront of adoption, of being in the forefront of piloting, some of the first companies to kind of move into the space. And so from that standpoint, it is it's important and critical, I would say, to be able to understand what the finance teams need from you all to be able to be in a position to say, we can now cut that check for continuous manufacturing and move into that new world. So what I want to talk about here is a number of questions that come to mind. How to deal with cash flows over time. How do we compare manufacturing alternatives, batch versus continuous, in different countries? That was in the study that I did with the FDA. I was looking at this analysis from the standpoint of not just the US focused investment and not just new, but also retrofit, but also in different countries where manufacturing decisions can be made as part of that process. How do we compare the manufacturing alternatives? How can we address inherent PCM cost uncertainty versus the more known costs associated with batch processing? And are there models or analytic tools that can be leveraged to answer those key questions? And the answer to that is yes to all of that. So the first thing is, and I know this graphic here is a little bit busy, so let me unpack this for you. Finance decisions, I don't care if you are, building an airplane, if you're a bank, or you are a pharmaceutical company. Finance decisions for manufacturing plant and equipment are typically based on measuring the project's net present value, NPV. It's like the universal constant, if you will, of investing one-on-one. And the decision rule for that is anytime your NPV is positive, you would make that investment. And so at the bottom of this graphic, I have kind of a little formula there. I don't want to get too busy with the technical side of this at all, but basically NPV is just simply summing up all of the costs, including your initial upfront capital costs, all of your ongoing costs, all of your ongoing revenues, right? So your revenues minus your costs in each year in the life of this project, and here I'm illustrating it goes out for 30 years. And when you add all that up and you apply a discount rate so that your cash flows are not all treated the same going out in the future as they are today, and you bring that back to the present, that dollar amount, that discounted sum of all those cash flows is your NPV. If it's positive, you go forward with the project. And if you're comparing two projects, if you have an NPV that's greater, let's say for CM versus batch, you're going to move out with that. You're going to get a higher NPV off of that CM project than you are in batch. In my research, that's what I was looking at. I was comparing the net NPV once we compared the NPV of CM less the NPV of batch. And if that number was positive, then it was signaling that CM was the better investment strategy. And so as you can see in this graphic, then years 1 through 15, as I've illustrated, and this is an illustration, it's not an actual, you make your initial investments and you can see those bars kind of lie below that horizontal line, meaning there's some negative cash flows for a period that are then start to become offset by those bars at the top that are indicative of your ongoing revenue stream that you're deriving over that life of that project. Then at the end of the life of that project, you wind up with some termination and salvage value that you take into account, probably not as much as all the net revenues that you've been producing. And again, that's essentially what your project NPV approach is. So you've got to gather up all your data on how much it's going to cost to initially get your plant and equipment in place for a CM project, and what your expectations and estimates of ongoing maintenance and operating expenses are going to be, and what your ongoing revenues, what products are you going to be able to make on this platform in this facility. And so when you do that, we really are thinking technically most investment decisions are doing this on what we call a static NPV basis. As you see in this figure on the right-hand side, that just simply means that we calculate all these revenues and costs across in a single path, in a single time profile, rather than multiple profiles that could be more dependent on uncertainties around some of those revenues and uncertainties around some of those costs. And so that's a very straightforward way, and the vast majority of investment decisions for some time now in various sectors are made just like we're seeing here. Static NPV one path of assumption on costs and revenues. And at the end, when we sum all that up, do we get a positive number? But as I say at the bottom of this slide, what happens if those key inputs are not very well established? Let's suppose that what goes in to define your operating costs are not as stable or as known as you would like. Let's say compared to batch, where we've been using it for years and we know that process very well. But in the case of CM, we're not maybe as familiar with what those ongoing operating costs are going to look like, or those upfront investment costs could vary to some degree. How do we deal with that? And so the how we deal with that is this financial uncertainty that I'm speaking to. And the fact that upfront investment costs might be different and might vary quite a bit. There may be a lot of variation around that for CM versus batch. The revenue stream, this which depends on manufacturing capacity, which in turn depends on throughput per hour, which is itself a function of overall equipment effectiveness, or OEE we call it. And that OEE turns out to be a very, very critical part or input to your cost function. It can be a benchmark to measure your process efficiencies, to compare between batch and continuous, or identify inefficiencies or process bottlenecks. So OEE is a very handy metric that can be used to kind of compare batch to CM processes, particularly from an efficiency standpoint. And then also annual variable costs of operating a PCM facility come into this concern around financial uncertainty. So in this schematic, what we have here is we have a batch process where we have a variety of different unit operations conveyed up at the top. And you can see various OEE percentages arrayed down under each of those units. And they vary, right, from 40% multiplicatively all the way up to 90% for this unit 6 that we have identified. So that at the end of the day, when you roll that math up, it turns out that your overall OEE for batch, and again, these are numbers that, in working with my colleague Richard, we've been able to identify as industry-like numbers, that OEE for batch tends to be like 6%. When we look at a corresponding continuous manufacturing process, the OEEs on that look vastly different, 90%. This is back to that very first slide where we're showing that one of the big benefits that you get from PCM over batch is the process efficiency gain. And so that variability, that 90%, how comfortable are you with that number? Are you going to make a multi-million-dollar investment decision for continuous banking on that 90% as that is a static known number? Or will you look at maybe some variability around that so that your financial decision makers have a higher level of confidence when they go into making a decision, saying, well, we just didn't lean solely on assuming it was 90%. We gave a bit more variability around plus or minus what that 90% could look like. And I'll show you in a second what that turns out to be. So when you look at things here, again, batch, the numbers are fairly well known, so you don't really have to kind of generate this distribution around these various assumptions such as OEE. But in the case of PCM, where as I show in this graphic, that solid blue curve is the average path of NPV over the life of this project that would take on over that period. And then those dashed lines above and below that average path are now the uncertainties. Think of it as over here in the States when and it's hurricane season now, and when there's a hurricane coming, our NOAA weather group will actually generate the cone of uncertainty. Think of those dashed lines as the cone of uncertainty around NPV paths for pharmaceutical investment in continuous manufacturing, and that if we can then know, one standard deviation plus or minus, 2 standard deviations plus or minus, what the NPV is going to be, we can give that financial decision maker a lot more confidence about making the decision, even though there's uncertainty around the cost structure of PCM versus batch. And that's sort of the big takeaway from this, is that is trying to get that financial decision maker more comfortable with making a decision like that. And so the idea is we've been wrestling with this in the financial services industry for years. And basically, what we do is we leverage techniques such as Monte Carlo simulation to generate dynamic variables. Like we could create a dynamic OEE variable in this case. We call those stochastic variables. And what that basically does is if you have a mean level of OEE and a standard deviation estimate of standard deviation around OEE that you can empirically derive, then you are off to the races to be able to simulate NPVs over hundreds, if not thousands, of different possible paths. In my FDA research, for example, I simulated over 10,000 different possible permutations of NPV to generate that distribution, which winds up being an NPV distribution as opposed to just one path distribution. If I'm a financial decision maker and I'm faced or presented with making an investment in CM versus batch, and I know what the batch costs, I know what our revenues are with a high degree of certainty, and I don't really have that level of confidence in the certainty around CM equivalents, I'm very likely going to be shying away from wanting to kind of go down the path of continuous manufacturing until I can gain that level of confidence I'm speaking of. And so basically what we do is we will, and in this example, we can take a variable like OEE, could be other variables that we're incorporating into our analysis, but OEE is a big driver, as I said earlier, of NPV. And we can simply take the average values and the standard deviation around that average, the two pieces of information you would need to then simulate what NPV would be for the entire project over its life, represented by those spaghetti lines that you see there on the left-hand side, that when aggregated and binned up, generate this histogram. And over enough of these trials, if you kind of went to 10,000 or even more, you get a nice smooth distribution. Now that distribution doesn't look normal or like a nice bell-shaped curve, largely because we think a cost structure takes on this log normally shaped distribution. And that's typical of what we find when we're trying to make these financial decisions. So at the end of the day, we can borrow from another concept that we leverage quite heavily in the financial services side, namely value at risk, or VAR for short. Basically, what the premise of that is to say that suppose if I'm a financial decision maker on I'm making a decision around continuous manufacturing, I want to be 99% sure that over 10,000 different possible outcomes of NPV, that we're going to wind up being profitable, that we're going to wind up being, in other words, NPV positive. If you can convince me that 99% of the time I'm going to wind up being NPV positive for a CM investment, I'm in. And that's what this technique will do for you. And that is exactly what financial decision makers, CFOs, portfolio managers on the banking side do. We monitor what we don't call it net present value VAR, but we monitor the value at risk of our portfolios from suffering losses over a single trading day. And we want to make sure that 99% of the time we can withstand losses no greater than X dollars. We're just simply taking that principle, that concept, and applying it here to the financial decision making that has to go on around CM, where there's a bit of uncertainty around it. And so basically to do that, all I'm saying is that we gather up our estimates of revenues, all the revenues associated with whatever products you're producing, batch versus CM, all the expenses for both types, batch versus CM, same thing on the upfront capital costs, and each of those little boxes in blue, yellow, and gray signify a path, a trial. You can imagine there's 10,000 of those on each dimension, and that they ultimately will generate 10,000 NPVs in the middle, and that you can repeat that set of calculations, A, for generic products, B, for brand products, for whatever your company is. You can leverage this type of technology, this type of analytics, that is, to generate these estimates of NPV. So you can definitely make the case Monte Carlo simulation, or MCS here, can extend that static NPV analysis that's pretty basic and isn't very well equipped to handle the kind of analysis needed for CM because of the uncertainties around costs, etc. And so it's a very, very effective tool for being able to do that. It can be applied to both new and retrofit plant decisions, brand and generic products, US versus offshore siting. And again, when we're talking about all the billions of dollars that have been of commitments that have been coming back to the United States in manufacturing pharmaceutical products, this now becomes an area where CM plays a role, and this type of analytic technology can really kind of be brought to bear when you're making that decision. And you can incorporate all sorts of sensitivity parameters to add an additional level of conservatism to the analysis. And so we call this NPV VAR. And at the end of the day, it really is tried and true in other sectors, including financial services, and could be certainly a game changer for those decision makers trying to get across the goal line. The fact that CM is not just effective on an engineering and scientific level, but also on a financial level. It makes a lot of sense. So the financial justification, right? Positive NPV across just not baseline scenarios, but across a lot of different scenarios, higher facility utilization, reduced batch failure risk that we see in the processes that are leveraged today, shorter cycle times, NPV at risk scenarios are really kind of something that companies ought to be thinking more about. And in my own analysis, my study that I did for the FDA, even under conservative assumptions, and I took a lot of different assumptions into account: taxes, hedging costs, if you're having to repatriate dollars back from one country to another, that continuous manufacturing turned out to have a higher overall net NPV over batch, and in terms of the long-term value creation. From a competitive standpoint, PCM lowers cost per gram, supports sustainable pricing strategies. There's an agility benefit here. Faster technology transfer and flexible campaign planning allows entry into smaller niche and orphan markets. Regulatory and customer confidence. You think about it from the standpoint of early adoption. Those early adopters can gain credibility with regulators as technology leaders. And then the barrier of entry issue here too, that if you establish PCM now, it creates a long-term moat against competitors who delay adoption. So for those reasons, it makes a lot of sense, but you need to be able to sell it to the finance teams. And what I've just kind of laid out here is an approach that you could leverage for that purpose. So when I think of recommendations, before we kind of wind this up, from the standpoint of biopharmaceuticals, I would propose beginning with a hybrid continuous manufacturing strategy. So it's a combination of kind of bringing CM into your traditional batch process that you have today, maybe focusing on high value things like monoclonal antibodies or next gen biologics, where the productivity gains that you would see would have the biggest value to your company. At the same time, and in parallel to that, I think about developing a roadmap toward a fully continuous. So moving away from the hybrid to a fully continuous model, end to end, within a 5 to 7 year time frame, and embedding those advanced process controls and digital infrastructure into that capability. And if you do it that way, if you phase it in, as opposed to trying to start big at the very beginning, which I don't think I've seen enough projects over time to try to start big and they fizzle out, that it'll not only deliver short-term return on investment, but a more sustainable competitive advantage in terms of cost, speed, market agility, over the next 10 years or whatever that time horizon might be. And then finally, we got to kind of ultimately get the financial decision makers on board. You should develop a comprehensive NPV analysis that identifies potential uncertainties, utilizes simulation-based methods to frame that investment decision. in terms that A, provide a broad array of possible outcomes, and B, provides decision makers with the level of comfort that they need to be able to write that big check for your company. So I think with that, I'm gonna stop there, Ian, and maybe we can kind of launch into questions for the remainder of our time. There probably will be a number of questions, I can imagine.
For sure, for sure. And I just want to start off actually, and thank you very much for that presentation, Cliff, because I think it was really interesting and really super useful. I just want to start off with a question that I think a lot of people have kind of are going to be asking. One of the biggest hurdles to adopting CM has been regulatory hurdles for the approval of CM on the same product that's being used, being made using batch. Has that changed? Has it not changed? Is it still the biggest hurdle?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, it has changed quite a bit. I think early on, when continuous manufacturing was being discussed in pharmaceuticals and conferences and whatnot, there were, it was the case that there were a lot of regulatory barriers. But to FDA's credit, they've really been at the forefront of kind of getting the industry comfortable with thinking about adoption of CM technology. And they've done that a couple of ways, right? They had their emerging technology program, the faster approval timeframes for CM. As I said earlier in the presentation, I think there are about 17 products now that are drug products that are now approved for use with CM by FDA. So that's kind of moving forward. But then also, I think with the revisions and whatnot that came about with ICH Q13, the guidance on continuous manufacturing, that was really a lot about harmonization across not just in the U.S. here, but across the globe. And so I think for that reason, we're starting to see that the regulatory environment is become a much more favorable environment for companies trying to get CM off the ground. So it's not to say that there aren't regulatory hurdles still, and I wouldn't say that. I mean, there are, but that compared to what we had in the past, I think we're seeing that CM, the friction points from a regulatory standpoint, are less than they have been. And this is about as good an environment right now that we've had to try and move forward with CM.
I guess another question which comes up, which has come up, which is where do companies most often go wrong when pitching this kind of internally to a finance team?
Yeah, so that's I think it comes down to the finance folks. I want to speak in generalities here, right? Because there's different flavors of finance people out there. But the financial professionals worry about a few things, right? If your company is publicly traded, for one, right? There's the quarterly drumbeat of earnings issue that always these companies face, and so they have to be very careful with their investment dollars because they're always kind of mindful of what's on the horizon from a financial performance standpoint that they have to communicate out to their shareholders. So kind of like back to the title of my presentation, you have to start thinking like a CFO. The CFO cares about dollars and cents. They're going to be, they may be wowed by the potential benefits of CM, but they really you have to frame out the decision making and get away from things like, the status quo is actually presents a risk to the company. It's something that you really need to be thinking isn't, think of batch as being an enabler. We've done it for so many years, we're going to continue to do that. But you could frame this as more of it's a risk to your business if you don't start thinking about CM. You can look at it from the standpoint of pointing out batch vulnerabilities, right? There's the cost of batch, the variability of batch. There's product hold time issues. There's the manual deviations and all the defects. These are liabilities to your company that are not just physical liabilities, but they can present financial liabilities and what we would think of is risk. There could be reputation risk. So I think it's important to kind of try to think of it that way. And that's an area where I don't think that the non-finance folks are probably as well suited to be able to frame that, because again, they're not the finance specialists, right?
Mm, mm,
Uh, there are, and I think one of the big issues too that's holding back is you have to change the financial math. You have to move toward a total cost of ownership type of mentality, looking at the long-term operational savings, not just the short term, but the long haul, right? Because in the long haul, this is where the power of CM is really going to show up, um, and be able to, try and leverage, let's say, pre-cleared technologies. That is, where the FDA has, if you're dealing with the FDA, and you've got an advanced manufacturing technology designation on your process, show your executives a CM process can be developed once, and can be reused for multiple products in the pipeline, where you're amortizing your capital costs down. So you have to start framing it in those kinds of ways. And then an important one, which, and again, it really isn't so much the scientific community issue so much there as it is an issue with the company, in terms of everybody operates with incentives, right? There's always financial incentives.
mhm.
All of us, management teams, staff, etc., right? We operate through the means of financial incentives, and those usually get translated from KPIs, various metrics, right? And people get paid on these metrics, and the metrics are typically things like short-term volume, productivity, that sort of thing. And we ought to start thinking about incorporating, or at least changing some of the way we think about what our KPIs are: efficiency, waste reduction, long-term value to the company, that sort of thing. And I think if we try and move toward that approach to convincing our finance colleagues that CM is really a game changer, then I think that's going to probably be one of the best ways that you can pitch this to your teams.
I think it speaks to one of the other questions that's come up, and I looked at this question, excuse me, and thought it's a very cynical view, but I kind of see the point, which is, how do you deal with the fact that batch is already paid for, whereas continuous needs a big upfront investment? And I think the key thing for me about that is that actually, when we talk about the shift in process, it's not just the kind of physical infrastructure, new manufacturing capabilities. It is the training. It is all of the kind of other stuff around it that is almost like, it's not an invisible cost, but there are costs that are going to be there. So how do you get over that kind of, well, we've already invested in this? How do you do it?
Yeah, again, I come back to, I think, you have to convince these teams that there is incremental value above and beyond the investment of training, the investment of plant and equipment. And this is where I say again, you have to look at the total cost of ownership over the long
Mm,
term. You have to
mm,
convince them that yeah, there's upfront costs involved, and it might be a 3 to 5 year period before we actually start to see the needle move the other direction for CEM overall compared to batch. But I do think one of the biggest hurdles, and I mentioned it and you brought it up here, is that sunk cost trap, the depreciation. And that for particularly for retrofit, that becomes maybe one of the most difficult things to get over, because it's an
mm,
accounting principle, right? That you can depreciate your plant and equipment over the life of the project, and that once that's been fully depreciated, it's almost like free money. You can continue, if that thing is still operating, you can keep going. And it is difficult. That's a tough one. I will admit that CM tends to be much more, at least the case for it to make it to your financial decision makers is more likely to be made on new facility than it is on a retrofit for exactly
Mm,
that reason.
mm,
Having said that, you have to look at the all-in things like OEE of batch versus continuous, the efficiency, the calculating the lower scrap defect rates associated with it, the lower environmental footprint, the lower cost of operation because of that, lower electricity needs or energy needs, et cetera, et cetera. You won't need as many people, so yeah, you have to train some of these new folks up, but at the same time, you're going to more of an automated process because you don't have to have all the same people online as you used to have. So there are a number of arguments you could try and make that fits into that financial equation, and that's the pitch that I think you have to focus on. Yeah.
this isn't really, I guess, a financial point. Maybe it is, maybe I'm wrong. But one question that came up was how much competitive advantage comes from moving early into CM rather than how long, and how long does that advantage last?
Yeah, well, what we see from other industries varies. And so CM right now seems to be rather sticky from an investment standpoint. Right now, there are some companies that have been, as I said, that are fast movers into the space more than others. But by and large, particularly around generics, right? If you're a generic producer and OSD products, whatever, you're challenged, right? Your margins are so thin that you're kind of thinking, I'm staying with my tried and true batch here unless there is some overwhelming reason to the contrary. And so in the batch space, in the generic space rather, that's another limiting factor. However, interestingly enough, in my own analysis, though, I was able to show that with the assumptions and everything that I had available on a large OSD product, we're not talking biopharma here, but we're talking OSD, that generics, even for generics, CM was higher NPV across multiple scenarios, 95% of the time than compared to batch. So I still think it's there from a competitive advantage standpoint. I can't give you, speak to the any empirical numbers on CM versus batch, but what we've seen in other areas that anytime you innovate into a new technology, you do gain that benefit in that space for some time. Is that 1 year? Is that 5 years? It's hard for me to kind of say exactly what that is, but you do get
Mm.
that first mover advantage or early mover advantage for a period that can actually put some wind at your back from a competitive standpoint. Now, if you're in a niche product, where maybe you're the only producer or only a handful, maybe it's not as important. But if you're in an area, a space that gets crowded, that could be a game changer.
Mm. You mentioned before about there is a difference here in terms of, are you retrofitting or are you building a new facility? And are there any good reasons not just to do CM for any kind of new facility? If you were kind of building something from scratch, why would you stick with batch?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I see it. Other than the only reason comes back to the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality, right? That there's what I've come to realize again in my sector in financial services, and I've spent a lot of time on this, is that senior management teams um, suffer like all of us from a variety of different cognitive biases. Ambiguity bias or the fear of the unknown is probably one of the bigger ones. And I
Mm,
think this is one of the reasons why, back to answering your question, why would you, not leverage CM for new facilities at the very least? It would be because of the fear of the unknown, that bias
mm,
that managers have. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in this discussion here today is to say, let's approach this from the standpoint of we understand that there is this fear of uncertainty. We can allay some of that by applying very well known techniques from other areas to show you that we can give you that level of confidence needed to get you over the hump away from that fear of uncertainty. So there's that. I think again, management goals need to change a bit. This whole volume and quota based approach. Focus on reducing costs to the very lowest value. Those KPIs need to be shifted a little bit so that we focus on innovation and on efficiencies and things like that, and making sure that we're improving the quality of our products. And I know we have some of that in KPIs today in pharma, but nonetheless, I think the more we press on that, that will also be one of the limiting factors that can be removed in making better decisions around CM.
And I think just kind of following on from that a little bit, there is that kind of, I wouldn't call it conservatism. I think it is, this is the system we've always worked with. We know it works. All of our in-house expertise is in this area. And actually, if you do want to move to CM, whether it's new or retrofitting, then that's an important question. And having the finance guys on side and them going, look, we need to move to this. There's a really strong financial case. Actually can help a CEO get over that. If it ain't broke, we don't have to fix it kind of approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I at the end of the day, you have to convince these teams, whether they're the CEO and the CFO and even the head of production units, etc., and your board. The boards are also folks that are very mindful of these things too, and we know the following facts. We know that CM has a lot of virtues, a lot of physical, technology, scientific, engineering, all of those things, benefits to that. No question, right? We can check the box on that. But until you can convince your financial decision makers that we truly understand at the atomic level the cost structure and the product set and revenue streams that are generated from the CM side, then you are going to have a hard time convincing them. Having said that, as I also said at the outset, there are a number of companies, and cultures differ from one pharmaceutical company or any company for that matter to another. There are some cultures, just like for AI today, right? I think of AI in some respects as kind of like people trying to make decisions about CM. There's a lot of uncertainty around adoption of AI, but a lot of companies also realize, most companies realize, if they don't get on board with some level of integration of AI into their capabilities, they're going to be behind, and that's going to cost them from a competitive standpoint. Same thing is true here for CM, but to a lesser extent, because it turns out the manufacturing is kind of like the tail end of the horse, right? It's the R&D, it's all that up front. If you're again one of the large innovators, the large cap innovators, you're focusing much more of your attention up front on that space, and the manufacturing just kind of comes along. And so I can get by with batch because I know it, and I'm going to continue to know it, and that's fine. And CM, while yeah, maybe that gives me some advantages, it's a manufacturing process in the end, whereas AI is ubiquitous across the entire enterprise. So there are those kinds of things where culture matters. There are companies that have very sort of progressive, forward-thinking executives that are embracing the new technology, even though there are risks and uncertainties. They're willing to do that, and others that are much more risk averse, and they're kind of holding out and they're saying, I don't think we want to go there yet. What I'm proposing here is a way to try and get those more risk averse financial decision makers to understand that yes, that CM can give a high degree of confidence in being profitable over the long
run. I presume biopharma, I think you touched on this earlier, would be included in the group that might have a better chance at leveraging CM. Would you agree with that? What about CDMOs?
So absolutely. The biopharma side, because of relatively high margins, that's where I think one of the sweet spots is across the entire pharma sector to be able to take and leverage CM to the hilt. I think that by virtue of the fact that there is that cushion, if you will, gives CM a little bit of puts a little bit more wind at CM's back than you would find for maybe more on the non-biologic side. For CDMOs, there's a play there for sure, and I think companies, the CDMOs, this is where back to the competitive edge standpoint. I think if you can show your customers that you are adopting technologies that are going to save them money, are going to lower their defect rates, their quality is going to get better, and at the same time, overall, provide them with greater profitability. And you can give them, again, that confidence level. Again, you can apply the same type of thing that I'm doing here to show your customers that CM is a better value-added process than using tried and true batch. I think it would work as well for CDMOs.
Mm, mm. Um, Over the next 5 years, I've heard that between 370 and $500 billion has been committed by pharma companies to manufacture drugs in the US. Is CM a factor in that? How does it factor into that activity?
Yeah, so that's a huge shift, right? That's happened. Even though those are commitments and commitments can change, those are pretty big numbers. And what that tells me, and again, I go back to my own research study on this too, when I was looking at comparing the NPVs of CM and batch, and in my case, it was 4 different countries. I was looking at not just the US, but I also was looking at uh, India, China, and Ireland, and taking into account, as I said before, corporate tax rates and all sorts of other kind of idiosyncratic kind of differences between those companies that would countries rather that would factor into the investment decision. And I would say in the case of companies that are looking to pour money into the United States from a manufacturing standpoint, it kind of also goes back to our earlier conversation about why not CM over batch if you're now starting fresh. Now, some of those companies might be saying, well, you know what, we've got some existing facilities here in the United States, and we're just going to retrofit some of that, and we'll just expand it, and we'll, move into batch more than we had. I think this is now a time to really think about the long-term strategy, not just kind of like, okay, we're gonna put $5 billion into our plants here in America. We're gonna refresh them. We're gonna continue to expand out and scale them more, but we're gonna kind of stay with what we've got. Uh, I would challenge these companies to think about, just like I said earlier about AI. You need to really
Mhm.
think about not what's happening in the next year, 3 years from now, but where is the industry going in the next 5 to 10 years, and prepare for that now. And if you start to have that mindset, that kind of like longer term mindset, I'm convinced that you would come back to the decision that CM is the preferred process to build your products off of, whether it's biopharma or not. You take that long run view. I think that's got to be where the value for CM will certainly shine over batch in the long term. Yep.
Mm, mm. Got time for a couple of other more questions, and I love this one because it kind of turns things on its head a little bit. What does a bad CM business case usually look like?
A bad CM business case look like? A bad CM. Okay, there's a couple ways that I could go at this. One bad CM business case is that you haven't done your homework on the finance side, and you go down the path, have the conversation with your finance folks, and you show them all the virtues that it can provide in terms of engineering and technical benefits and efficiencies and all those great things that I had in one of my early slides. If you go in and have that conversation up front and trying to convince your finance guys, they're gonna just go, yeah, that's not gonna work, and it's not gonna be possible. Having said that, let's suppose now you've gone down a bad CM adoption. Could it's always possible. I mean, it's like, again, I use AI as an example. You could have a bad AI adoption, and I've certainly
Mm,
seen that again on the financial services side, where companies have have decided that they're going to allow kind of almost like a free-for-all where different groups are building out their AI capabilities, and there's no centralized AI, at the enterprise level that's kind of making sure that reusability and other concerns are taken into account. The same thing can be true around CM implementation. I mean, there's any number of ways that a bad CM could come out. You could simply not you may not have the right product sets or the product line set up in a manner that is consistent with making sure that it's going to be profitable over the long term. There are many missteps that could occur along the way of everything from facility location to having an availability of the right labor resources, the right trained labor resources. So any number of problems could happen that could turn out to have a bad CM outcome for you. But and this is why planning is critical. You just can't you can't take this on as just a technology solution. It has to be, it's a strategic decision. Sometimes I think manufacturing is viewed upon as being just a widget, right? It's just kind of a part of the overall cog of what pharmaceutical development is about. But it is a critical component, and it has to have a strategic framing around it that isn't just technical, that it's an all-encompassing, including the financials of this, so that the process is successful in the long term. So it's interdisciplinary. I'm reminded of when I was at an organization, Freddie Mac. Some of you probably heard of that, very big company, and we had a technology revolution in the mid '90s. Comes back to the question about competitive edge. We built the industry's first automated underwriting system. And while looking back now, what is that, 30 years ago or whatever, it really transformed the marketplace in a big way and gave us an advantage for a time over Fannie Mae before they came online with it. But it completely revolutionized the way in which mortgages were made. It was no longer manual. Think of that as like a batch process in manufacturing. And no one wanted to change it because, oh, goodness sakes, we wouldn't want to go to this new technology, which is really based on statistical modeling. And once we went down that path, people were like, this is a game changer. And I believe CM is the same thing here. It's just more technology than maybe what we were talking about back in '96 with AUS. But it is nonetheless, it was an interdisciplinary endeavor and was our primary strategic goal for the company to get that online. And by the way, the underwriting piece of that, critical, but in the grand scheme of things, it was the securitization of those assets that was our bread and butter, and that the virtual manufacturing of these loans turned out to be one of the most critical innovations that has happened in the last 50 years for mortgages. And I think CM can be the same thing for pharma.
One last question before we begin to close, and I like this question as well. If you were advising a CFO, what are the top 3 metrics that you'd want on one page before approving CM?
Well, at the very top of my list, if I were the CFO, I would want to be shown a metric that says I can be 99% confident, because I'm a risk-averse type of guy. I would want to be 99% confident that if we invest in CM over the next 5 years, that it will be NPV positive. Boom. That's my number one. If I'm CFO, you got to show that to me, and I got to be comfortable with the range of assumptions and numbers that go into that, right? Because you can make all sorts of stuff up, but it's got to be robust, and I got to be convinced they're realistic. So the second thing is I would also want to see, again, if I'm the CFO, I would want to see comparisons of my relative value of production. So this is more of a product efficiency, or maybe a product value standpoint of CM. The throughput that I can, how much can I put through my CM process versus my batch process? some flavor of metric like that. And then of course, and again, this is just my own bias, but I want to see all sorts of quality metrics on that that can show that I am meeting or exceeding not only what my batch process does by a factor or factors, but also what regulatory expectations might dictate for that. So those are some. Those are some. I'm sure there are others, but those off the top of my head, I'd be thinking about.
Excellent stuff. One last thing. If there was one sentence that you'd like everybody to remember from this presentation and these questions, what would it be? What's the one thing?
I would say to convince financial decision makers on whether to invest in CM, you should apply NPV tools that allow those decision makers to get a greater level of confidence. And that's where Monte Carlo simulation based capabilities come in. That's a long sentence, but anyway, that's where
it's a long sentence, but I'll give you that. That's so good. Cliff, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for a really, really interesting presentation. And that about wraps up the future of biopharma analysis for one more year. We will be back in 2027. So Cliff, I'm going to be reeling you in again for another one.
All right.
Don't do anything like retiring in the meantime. Not
no retirement from me, but thank you very much.
Definitely none for me either. So I will be back here in a year's time. Thank you all for attending. It's been a brilliant, brilliant bunch of sessions. You're the most important people out there, the audience. We wouldn't do this if you weren't there, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much. And with that, thank you, Cliff. Future Biopharma Analysis 2026 is closed.